welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm April Knight, and you're watching our News 2 election special sponsored by the Bryan Roach campaign. Today we have Albert Bryan with us and Senator Tregenza Roach, and they're going to be sharing with you some of the key aspects of their platforms, as well as issues that are significant to the territory, as well as make their final pitch to voters as well, because in a few days voters will head to the polls again to make the final decision on who's going to win the governor's race. So if you want to hear where they stand on certain issues, stay with us for the next hour. I'm sure that these gentlemen need no introduction, but I'm going to say some things anyway. Albert was a labor commissioner for 8 years. Mm-hmm. You founded, and you're a founder and president of the ABRA Group. That's correct. Co-founder and managing partner of Master Strategies VI, and you were once the chairman of the Economic Development Authority and the Government Development Bank. That's correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, okay. So, and then Senator Roach, three-term senator, taught at UVI as well. You served as legal counsel to the VI Commissioner of Education earlier in your career. And then you were executive director of the Board of Education, among other public interest roles. So let's get some things out of the way very quickly before we get to the meat of your platform. Let's clarify what happened with this debate situation.
Right.
According to the other camp, you refused to debate, but I saw a response from you on Facebook that said it was a scheduling issue. So what really happened there?
So we were never actually approached by the other camp to debate. We've had no conversations with them. Mm-hmm. The consortium called us and asked us if we could debate on Tuesday, and we said we couldn't debate on that day. We gave them a date, the Monday before the election, because one of the things that we take into account is we've done over 15, 16 debates, a lot of which the governor chose not to show up to. As a matter of fact, he canceled the last debate that we were really counting on to give us the edge in the election, the Channel 12 consortium debate. That would probably have been the most watched debate of the season. So we couldn't say yes, and then we'd have had 4 other requests at the time to do debates. And what happened during the general election is we got real off message attending these debates. And we think it actually hurt us in terms of our time speaking with people, contacting them, shaking hands, because that's what actually got us to this point. So we're open and ready to debate. We have Monday night. I think we still have that time carved out. So if they want to come, we're more than ready.
Okay, Senator Roach, I wanted to ask you about the free tuition policy. Now, there's a bit of controversy surrounding the ownership of this particular legislation. The governor sent the Senate his version of the bill, but you actually have your own piece of legislation already in the Senate. When I asked Governor Mapp about it, he said that the governor's bill cannot be preempted. What is your take on that?
Well, first of all, I'd like people to understand what preemption means, because sometimes we use the words and we think that everybody is on the same page.
Okay.
Some people think I did something to stop the governor from bringing his bill, and he has helped people think that way as well. Preemption simply means that an issue is before the legislature already. And I depend on the legal counsel of the legislature to make those decisions. What happens is that you submit a bill idea, they research whether something similar has been submitted, and then they write you and they tell you that you've been preempted. So whether the governor has an issue with the legal counsel or not, that's his business. I take the word of the legal counsel. These are the rules of the legislature that we operate by. It said that my bill that had been introduced in 2013, in 2015, and in 2017 preempted the governor.
Okay.
As you know, when I came into the legislature, we were following the Tregenza refinery closure. We were following the economic decline, economic recession, whatever you want to call it. And so finding a source to fund the bill has always been an issue. But I wanted to keep introducing it into the legislature because I felt it was an important idea, a historic idea that could change the future of all the children in the territory. I had co-sponsors for the bill as well. when the governor sent in his measure, a funding source had been identified, but people should also be aware that I had felt the idea so significant that I said, even if we didn't succeed in getting it through the legislature, I would bring it to the Bryan Roach campaign as one of our platform ideas to accomplish it from an executive level. It was after we started talking about it publicly that the governor came out with his proposal. Now, what has happened is that the bill has now been amended. In my original bill has been amended, and the legal counsel has redrafted it. The legislature has a process. It's called pro forma, a pro forma process of bills, and that's when they officially get a bill number and are assigned to committee. And the president of the legislature has decided that the bill will be submitted to a joint committee of finance and education.
Your bill?
Yes, and it will be considered by that committee. If the legislature declines to enact the measure as I have proposed it, anybody is free to submit a different version or idea of the bill, and they may be successful in getting it through.
And does that automatically open up the doors for the governor's bill to be considered?
Sure. Preemption just creates an orderly process of dealing with ideas so that we're not spending a whole lot of time having the same subject matter before different committees of the legislature. There is support for the bill. The governor has created this election frenzy around the bill because he created all these ads upon submission of the bill to the legislature. The bill is not intended to have the local government take up any obligations of students that may be addressed by federal funds. It is to supplement what they may get from Pell Grants, etc.
So federal funds first, and then whatever doesn't get covered.
That's right. So the process, if we want to have it affect students coming in 2019, which is the idea, that is the intent, students are required to apply for their federal funding by March. They really don't get responses until July. And then when that response comes from the federal government, we should be prepared to then determine how we would supplement their award. So there was no need, no urgency for it to be enacted in September to make an election issue of it. And it was really unfortunate that the bill became an election issue because—
And it was called into special session without a bill in front of the legislators.
Exactly. So you have students, oh, it's a free tuition. It's not a cup, a campaign cup or pen or pencil or t-shirt. This is something that the government of the Virgin Islands is going to invest in its people, and we want to have conversations about what happens next. What are the students going to be required to do? What grade point average will they be required to maintain? What will happen after they graduate? If we require them to stay here for employment, how will we facilitate their having meaningful employment instead of frustrating them? All of these are important questions to decide, not just to rush it through a process so I could make an ad and say, oh, vote for me, I passed the free tuition bill. It was never intended as an election issue. You see, you get me carried away with it.
Yeah, I know, I can see that. Okay, let me get to this next topic, which is what's on the ballot on the 20th. When I asked the governor this question, he said that there are dangers to installing a new administration. First and foremost, he said that it will slow down the hurricane recovery process. And second, it will strain relationships with Washington if we have a Democratic governor, since the president is so very openly against Democrats. Do you believe that?
That is nonsense. I mean, the one thing that he keeps bragging about is these appropriations and his plans, and you know, administrations transition all the time. When I left labor, there was a lot of money that was left there in indirect costs. There were money in grants that had to be administered because programs were in process. None of that money disappeared. When you look at what's happening in Congress now, the blue wave is making a comeback, and now we have the House again. So it reestablishes the balance that goes on in Washington. This is more about being able to manage the money that's coming in at a local level. And when you look at every single department, every single one is broken. It's like putting gas into a car with no wheels. And you've seen over the past couple months how the breakdowns in education, in the labor department, other breakdowns in human services. There are a lot of things that are going on in our government now that have destabilized the very grand process. Over $1.5 million from human services was recently sent back, and even more funds are in jeopardy because the focus is on all of this money and the election that's going on right now instead of the people and really managing the funds and making sure that departments are able to process. It's part of this state of the emergency scheme that he has had over for the last year to make the process now so that he makes all of the decisions. Tregenza Senator Roach recently had legislation overturned where now he has to come to the legislature and explain why we have this state of emergency, and it's kind of mum now. Now it's not under an emergency anymore. So what we're looking at is going in. We do not plan to do what he did, totally dismantle the government and fire people and send home people. We plan to look for the people who are doing their jobs well and using technology and other process improvement, help to get the process better. Put the people where they need to be, give the supervisors and the directors the autonomy, and put the commissioners to work establishing policy that will make for a smooth transition of government and expedite the use of these federal funds.
And you know, when the governor talks about that, he conveniently leaves out of the conversation that he was not single-handedly responsible for getting these federal funds. We have a Democratic delegate to Congress.
That's right.
And she was the very first person who introduced the idea of the 100% Medicare reimbursement that we're receiving now. A delegation from the legislature also went to Congress to lobby for that funding. A Democratic Senate, Democratic delegate who played a critical role in getting some of that funding. So we should not continue the narrative that he alone was responsible for getting these funds, and so it makes this
and if he doesn't get reelected, everything will stop. All the construction will stop. Well, that certainly seems to be the idea that's being sold to voters. Now, I want to ask you, how do you foresee your relationship with the legislature should you get elected? I've been covering the Senate for a while, and I'm noticing that there's sort of a strained kind of relationship with the executive branch. And we can see that, and sometimes the governor is saying that he's not going to enforce, certain laws, even though he overrode it. The Senate overrode the veto, and then essentially something is law, and he said he's not going to enforce it. Do you see that kind of relationship continuing, considering now that we have a lot of new senators too?
To your point, I think that this governor has a blatant disregard for respecting the three branches of government. And the powers. If you look at what he tried to do with the presiding judge, trying to remove him during his tenure, overreaching the powers of the executive branch. One of the things that I talk about all the time is reducing the amount of power that is invested in the governor of the Virgin Islands. It creates the kind of tyrannical situations that we have today. So working with the legislature, one of the things that we have been very successful at is uniting the Democratic Party. And we've done that by actually sharing our stage, the gubernatorial stage, which is a larger stage, and allowing Democratic senators to come in, repeating the things that they hold dear to their platform and ensuring them that as Democrats and as Virgin Islanders, we're going to support the agendas that they are pushing forward. So when it comes time for re-election, their things will be premier in terms of having been accomplished because they've been executed. I think this is really important in establishing that. We were successful in electing 13 Democrats. Now, I don't know if that's how the majority will end up, but we know one thing, that we will have a majority that is dominated by Democrats. We'll have a Democrat in the Senate, 1 in DC, and 2 in the government house. And it's important for us, during December, we have already decided that we're going to kind of get together and put all of the priorities of the senators and the priorities of the administration so we can create an agenda and move that forward. If we're going to really change course in the Virgin Islands, we're going to have an amiable relationship between the legislature and the executive branch. Just one more example. When the governor sent down the last ArcLight
agreement, the deal,
debacle agreement, they were getting upset because of questions that the senators posed to the developers. They wanted a little bit more. Well, that's a good thing. Why would this legislature be on the side of the government and the governor be supporting the Lime Tree people? You would think that the legislature and the executive branch would work together and say, well, if the legislature wants more for the people, why isn't that a good thing? The executive branch now goes back to the table and says, well, they denied your first attempt. Here's what you can do to make this deal sweeter and to get us the Virgin Islands a better shake. Instead,
that's what you would like to see.
Exactly. Instead, you have the executive branch now defending the contract with the contractor. Who are they fighting against? Not the legislature. They're fighting against the people of the Virgin Islands. So those are the kind of things that we would like to really look at. And we're not always going to agree, but I think that we'll have a great working relationship.
I mean, theoretically, since you're coming out of the legislature, Senator, that should help.
Well, I would underscore exactly what Albert said, because you have to understand the function of each branch of government, and you have to have respect for it. You pointed an example there where the governor has said on more than one occasion, even if you override it, I'm not going to implement it. He said that. When we voted to increase the bond funding for GERS by $100 million, he said if the bonds were floated, he wasn't going to give the money to GERS. They could go pack a lunch. So it's impossible for you to believe that you can have a working relationship with people if you have no regard for their role and no respect for their positions. And there are at least 6 of the returning members of the legislature with whom I have worked. And one thing that I know every single person would say is that I am able to work with people. As a member of the minority, knowing that you need votes from the majority to pass any measure, whether we had a disagreement on some issue yesterday or the day before, I come to each person and I say, this is the idea that I have. Will you support it? That's how you regard people in a system of checks and balances. The governor goes around and makes this big production. He has signs with my face on his signs. And they have no, that I say no each time.
Oh, yeah.
Where are the checks and balances? I'm not supposed to be a yes man. When you come and say you're going to put a pipeline under the sea of St. Croix and it's going to be 2 miles, and you're going to allow tankers to come into that area with 5 million barrels of oil, and if there is an accident, you have to also get help from Puerto Rico. You have to wait for them to mobilize and come to St. Croix. You can't expect me to say yes to that with a half a day's hearing, no public input. So if you have respect for the role of the legislature, you're going to be successful in working with them.
We were talking about GRS a little while ago, and this is the opportunity for you to reiterate to folks what your plan is about. Now, I've heard you speak in several forums, Albert, and you said that your plan for shoring up the government employees' retirement system is 3-pronged. You're going to lower the unfunded liability, secure payments to retirees, and lower the cost of the retirement system to the government. You also had several objectives under that, and you identified 5 funding sources. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So the funding sources, I think, are the most important, and we didn't come up with this thing just like pie in the sky. We actually sat down with our team. We reviewed a lot of the studies that were done by the GRS over the years. We reviewed the studies from the task force that were submitted and came up with some things that we think were important, like you said. And the number one thing is to make sure that we don't reduce the annuity, the payment of people who are already retired. The further away from retirement you are, the longer you have to plan for it. So there's a lot of education piece in our in our plan as well too. But the 5 funding sources, the most impactful funding source are distilleries. And the reason being is because we get the rum cover over. So as we produce, we get all of that money back. We get 2 grabs at it. So adding a distillery is number 1 in terms of generating revenue. With a revenue of even $80 million a year, we would have enough money to finance a $600 million bond to the GRS system. There's 2 grabs at the rum cover over money. You get 1 grab because you actually sent the rum.
Right.
And then we split the rest of the rum that's produced by other islands besides Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. We get a piece of that too. So if Puerto Rico produces 60% of the rum that's sent, for instance, they get 60% of that extra money. Well, they've been doing the calculation wrong for years, so Treasury actually owes us probably $100 million. Getting that calculation and getting $100 million would also be a new source of revenue. They wouldn't have to pay it back to us immediately. They could pay it to us over time, but it would guarantee a new revenue source to either fund a bond or to put money into the system. Sports gaming is another one. We have this $120 million fiber optic cable that we invested in that really hasn't given us anything except better Netflix. So if we use sports gaming as a new opportunity for the Virgin Islands, we can then be able to get money that'll be designated for the GRS by having sports gaming companies in the Virgin Islands. The gasoline and the gasoline tax is something that we've been debating for years, and we were almost there at one point, but we couldn't come to an agreement, and we kind of lost that opportunity. We could still go back if we get the refinery pumping again. And then finally, I think the most impactful for the future earnings of the Virgin Islands would be our cannabis research and patent registry. So the cannabis industry in the United States is a $24 billion industry. By establishing a research center in our technology park, there are certain strains, oils, topicals, different things that they're extracting from this botanical now that can be patented. Every time that thing sells, that product, whatever it is, if it's an oil, every time it sells, the Virgin Islands would get a piece of that money from the patent. This is a huge opportunity for us because it's just like Viagra or McDonald's or Kentucky. Every time a piece of chicken sells, Colonel Sandals gets money. Why would they come to the Virgin Islands? Because we're not going to give them a 90% tax break. We're going to give them a 60% tax break. But that's a huge tax break anywhere else. And that the rest of all of that money that's generated from taxes would be another funding source for the GRS. The thing about our administration coming into office is about having the ability to come out and lead. Before we started talking about medical marijuana research, everybody else was quiet. The MAP administration had 4 years, they never commented on it. The same thing with the tuition bill.
But it's a touchy topic still for some people.
But even the GRS is a touchy. When we started talking about the GRS, people told us we were crazy to create a plan. If you're going to lead in anywhere and you're going to move people forward, you're going to have to take risks. The reason why they call it a vision is because only you can see it. Leadership is being able to convince a group of people that this vision actually exists and that we should march forward toward it. That's leadership. We don't have that in the Virgin Islands. We have people who are more concerned with being re-elected than moving the people forward. I'm here for one reason, to fix it. And that's the only reason. So Tregenza and I, we're going to be doing the things that put the Virgin Islands on a new course, on a course towards finally resolving some of these lifelong problems. And that starts with people.
All right. We're going to take a little break. We're going to circle back to a few of the topics that we spoke about. You're watching our News 2 election special sponsored by the Bryan Roach campaign. We'll be right back.
On the eve of this critical election, let us add clarity to what Albert and I mean by change course now.
It's a recognition that the Virgin Islands has been on the wrong path for far too long. It is a commitment to a purposeful government that actually produces results. It has nothing to do with delaying or stopping our recovery from the storms. We value the recent progress made by our disaster volunteers and the resources secured by our government to include the delegates to Congress and the members of the legislature.
Change course now is not just about this administration or an election. It is about not letting our government do the same thing over and over while expecting a different result.
That is why our neighbors from Frederickstead to Bordeaux and Coral Bay say that change just can't wait.
We will hold ourselves accountable to the people of the Virgin Islands.
Vote number 5 to change course now towards a brighter Virgin Islands for all of us.
Paid for by Bryan Roach for Governor and Lieutenant Governor.
Hi, this is Tregenza Roach. In these final days of the election, you may have heard false, desperate advertisements sponsored by our opponents that I have been against the betterment of my friends and family on St. Croix. As a senator, I have had to say no, along with my colleagues, when we believe the governor has abused his power or has made decisions that rob opportunities from hard-working residents. For example, I have said no to the governor appointing his brother as Port Authority Executive Director, cousin to the Port Authority Board, and sister-in-law to the WICO Board instead of other more qualified Virgin Islanders. I have said no to purchasing executive limousines instead of buying new ambulances for our hospitals or first paving the roads in Frederickstead. I've said no to raising commissioners' salaries $10,000 to $20,000 higher while shortchanging deserving teachers at Ricardo Richards and police officers who patrol the streets in Christiansted. I did vote no on the Lime Tree Agreement because the governor forced us into a $40 million payday loan from a $1 billion company, pushed us to sell 300 acres of our precious Crucian soil at $10,000 an acre without an appraisal. And I said no to a deal that gave folks on St. Croix 17.5% less of refinery income than we were promised in the previous agreement. As leaders, we are measured not solely by our flowery words, but also our deeds and record as well. I proudly stand on my 3 terms as your senator over the Map Potter's new 90 days of busy work. On November 20th, the Bryan Roach team asked for your continued support and vote because change can't wait. Thank you.
This is Tregenza Roach, your candidate for Lieutenant Governor on the Bryan Roach team. As a senator in the Virgin Islands legislature, I have been pleased to support many measures on behalf of the people of St. Croix. I voted yes to $100 million in Garvey bonds financing for road repair work, which the governor let sit from 2015. I voted yes to making St. Croix the sports capital of the Caribbean by providing $20 million in financing to create a state-of-the-art sports facility at the Pauli Joseph Stadium. The governor has let it sit from 2014, and what is there now is a stadium in ruins, shrouded in dirt. I voted yes to $3.5 million to dredge the Schooner Bay Channel so that Gallows Bay could become a state-of-the-art facility and attract the small luxury liners. I voted yes to establishing the Bachelor of Nursing program at the University of the Virgin Islands so that St. Croix students would not have to travel to St. Thomas to complete their degrees. I voted yes to acquiring the property adjacent to Government House to create a proper governor's residence and to end the governor's wasteful spending of hundreds of thousands of dollars for accommodations at the Ritz-Carlton and private villas. I voted yes to constructing urgent care centers for the people of St. Croix in the absence of a proper hospital, and I voted yes to override the governor's veto of that legislation. Vote Bryan Roach, number 5 on your ballot, to end MAP's tyranny and to create a Virgin Islands for all of us.
Paid for by Bryan Roach for Governor and Lieutenant Governor.
Welcome back. You're watching our News 2 election special sponsored by the Bryan Roach campaign. Now earlier we had talked about quite a few topics, including clearing up some issues about this debate situation, the free tuition policy, as well as some of the things that the governor said he was afraid would happen if we installed a new administration. We also talked about GRS. Now you mentioned the Lime Tree deal earlier, Senator Roach. You voted no to the deal. Something that Governor Mapps said would bring back jobs to St. Croix, and that was his pitch. You know, he just wants this to operate so that he could bring back jobs and revive the St. Croix economy. Right. What are your ideas for jump-starting the St. Croix economy?
Well, you know, one of the things that I've been working on for a really long time with Senator Novell Francis, I worked a lot on his policy piece, and we've been trying to get a free trade zone in St. Croix. So if you look if you're familiar with St. Croix, from the refinery all the way down to the airport, end of the airport, it's a tremendous opportunity for development. The refinery has at least 4 power plants. It has 2 desal plants. It has a dump. It has a machine shop. It's an incredible place. I worked there for a number of years in materials management. And then when you go next door, also the refinery has a deep water port. And then next to it is the container port, which is also another deep water port. And then next to it is the Martin Marietta, old Martin Marietta Renaissance property. They're taking down the coal plant now, but in there's over 900 acres of industrially zoned land. Diageo has an extra 2 megawatts of power. Then you go next door, you have the racetrack, you have the dump facility, then you have a 10,000-foot runway with an industrial park, and then you have over 400 acres of beachfront property for development. What you have there is the ability now to get in and get a power producer that can produce 17 cents per kilowatt power that is unregulated by the PSC. That could start revitalizing our small manufacturing industry in St. Croix, bringing new jobs. You
like
also,
a private WAPA?
Yes, a private WAPA. And you also have the ability now to do marine development, whether it's ship inspections, it's marine repair. The BVI has the 3rd largest charter fleet in the world, and they're taking their boats as far as Trinidad in order to be repaired. The boat yards in Puerto Rico are stocked up, so are the ones in St. Thomas. Okay. St. Croix already has the land, so in marine repair, all these fancy yachts, we have the basins that you can put them, we have the off-ramps where you could take them and dry dock them. The opportunity is there. One of the things that we're working on now is a Marine Development Act, which will help all of this. We never market our assets. All these assets that we have dormant in St. Croix. Tregenza passed legislation of over $3 million to dredge the Gallows Bay port and develop Christiansted. Hasn't happened. $33 million has been allocated so far for the Frederiksted Polly Joseph Stadium. Hasn't happened. Getting these things up and going. In our 90-day plan, what we plan to do is have issue a RFP for shovel-ready private sector projects. Okay. And what we plan on doing is getting 3 main projects on each island, St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix Water Island if they have one too. And really looking at putting a project manager on them to facilitate whether it's a business license, CZM permit, Army Corps, financing, whatever it needs to keep that button pressed. And for me as governor to be able to go to New York if I have to, or wherever, to get that financing for them and get the full faith and pledge of the Virgin Islands government. That does so much for business development. The other thing that we want to do is, for years we have been relying on other developers to come to the Virgin Islands and tell us where things should be. Having a proper land and water use plan where we've identified properties that we want to have a hotel, want to have a recreation, green spaces, we want light industry here, will facilitate this process so much, because now we won't have to have a grand debate every time we want to do an economic development project. Exploiting the $120 million fiber optic cable that we have, I really believe that we have a huge future in services. If you can work from anywhere, why not work from here? We have beautiful weather. All we need is reliable power and high-speed internet. And then finally, we have 5 tax incentive programs that nobody knows about. Really going to the United States and focusing in on those Fast Company type of company in Inc. magazine, where you have those 500 small companies that do like $10, $20 million in revenue, getting them to relocate to the Virgin Islands and use our people in the process. All of those things are what I see the new economy of the Virgin Islands for. I mean, there'll always be tourism, and we got a lot of plans for that in St. Croix as well as St. Thomas, freshening our product. I get so energized when I talk about it because there's just so much opportunity out there, and we're wasting time talking and really getting the government. When we talk about our first pillar is stabilizing the government. When you have companies coming to the Virgin Islands, you have to be able to act quickly. We have a tight window now where we have a thriving stock market and people have money to invest. If this window closes, we lose our opportunity. So we have a lot of work to do, but in terms of generating money, I got your ideas, and I got the energy along with Tregenza.
Right.
I just wanted to underscore with regard to Gallows Bay. So that you know, a lot of people say they passed the
I thought they
legislation.
were waiting for the permit or something.
They're waiting on the permits, but I supported the legislation to provide funding for the dredging. There's like a $3.5 million award to dredge the Schooner Bay Channel. But it's an important thing to emphasize, because just as cruise lines are building huge
Bigger
ships,
and bigger
they're
ships.
building smaller ships as well, like the Ritz-Carlton is going to have its own line. And what they're looking for are the smaller, less traveled ports, places like Mustique, places like Gallows Bay. And that luxury line, those small luxury lines, typically their passengers are spending more per capita than the larger line. So that's important. We have also discussed, in addition to the things that Albert said, town development. I mean, when you come through Christiansted, when you come through Frederickstead, when you come through back street of Charlotte Amalia, there's just so much of this urban blight that we have to address and provide incentives for people to invest in. And what's also very critical, and a lot of people don't think about this, we need to facilitate movement between the islands of the territory.
Big time.
We need to provide affordable transportation.
180 round trip is the cheapest that I've seen.
Well, it's been as high as $300 round trip to go between St. Thomas and St. Croix. And if we have one economy, if we're going to have an economy where we can bounce off of one another, people from St. Thomas can go to St. Croix and support the economy there, and people from St. Croix, agricultural products moving back and forth between the islands, we have to provide affordable transportation, and that's one of the pieces that we've talked about as well.
You talked about revitalizing the towns, and I think, Albert, you talked about that in the forums as well. You mentioned giving EDC-like benefits to businesses that people would want in the towns. You also mentioned investing in downtown public schools and universal Wi-Fi, which I'm sure everybody's happy about. Walking around downtown, you don't have to get on your data plan.
You stay connected all the time because, you know, so I like I was just telling you in the break that I really love to see social interaction and how communities and societies develop. When you look at the freeway in America and how it is able to connect cities and allow people to live at further distances and commute, that's what the internet is, right? So what we in the Virgin Islands, for as far as we can remember, the only way to get money in here was on the docks or in the air. Now we have this tremendous pipeline that allows us to access the entire world market. And we're not taking advantage of it. And what we got to understand is that one little drop off the internet will swell this economy. And we're not focusing on it. So giving more people, more students access to the internet is crucial, not only to our future development, but to building industry from within. When you look at the young man, McKeel, Paris, that just won that, this is a Virgin Islander with very little resources. We don't have a formal pool training program or some school where kids go to practice pool. Won a world championship. Imagine if we were investing in our students in a specific way to make sure that we create the next Jeff Bezos, and we really put some work into creating the next Tim Duncan, what the impact would have. So, you know, when we look at our vision for the Virgin Islands, it's the best in tourism, talent, and technology in the Caribbean. And you have to be able to understand that if if the American economy has switched to service industries, right? People are the main generating factor of value because the ideas, the innovation. We have not shifted it in terms of a community and getting that education in a way that we kind of create an arena for people to come out of that and do wonderful things on the internet, be able to play sports, music, art, and develop our society in a whole, but bring a lot of new currency, improve our tourism market. Those are the things that we really see as being the base blocks of building a better Virgin Islands.
One of the things that you said a while back was that the Virgin Islands is still teaching its students in a 20th century environment.
That's
when
right.
we're living in a 21st century environment. And is that what you mean when you say we need to educate our people better?
Well, I get so irritated, you know, when I go to, when I see my daughter's homework and she has a little book planner and she's writing down all the dates of her tests. I'm like, listen, if you're going to work in this community, in the 21st century, they need to be teaching you how to do this on your phone or on your iPad, because even now, that's a medium that everybody's using. You go to a doctor's office or check into a hospital, doctors not working with clipboards, they're working with iPads. So we should be teaching our students not how to watch Netflix, but how do you incorporate Excel into your life in terms of using it as a program? What kind of apps are available out there that would allow you to be an entrepreneur? In junior achievement, which I was the executive director of for a while, we had this thing called Innovation Camp, and the kids, in 4 hours, they would be able to come up with new enterprises and businesses that would be some amazing products, like the Bully Watch, a watch that kept your GPS, and if you pressed the button, it would alert everybody who had the watch that you were being bullied and where you were located. So, I mean, the innovation is there, but we have to give them the resources now that we could continue to develop our young people.
Let's turn to healthcare. Now, every year, our CEOs, the CEOs of the hospitals, come to the Senate and lament underfunding or the cost of uncompensated care to them. And then you have problems like, you know, we have Medicaid expansion, but there's still people who are within certain brackets of income that they are not earning low enough to qualify for that, but they also don't have employers who offer them insurance, and they're kind of left out in the cold. So there are these different issues. How would you propose to kind of like make healthcare sort of more accessible to Virgin Islanders?
Tregenza likes this question.
Oh, okay. Let's go.
I got it's two parts.
Well, I think it's a couple of things, and that's the last point that you touched on is very important. It's critical because part of the uncompensated care is the fact that we have so many uninsured people in the territory, and we do have to attract more products. Whether you can get it as a small company, small businesses have a very difficult time insuring their employees. So we have to bring that piece back. Now, it's tempting when you're talking about health care to look at the immediate thing because that's the pressing thing. But in leadership, you also have to be expansive and think about how do you envision the future and what are the pieces of it. A very, very big piece, I believe, of our healthcare system and why I supported it so strongly is the establishment of the medical school at the university. Because if you notice any area where you see a medical school founded, the entire environment changes. The health environment changes. You attract more professionals, which is one of the difficulties that we have. You attract the ancillary industries, then your economy prospers on a whole, and you can engage even in medical tourism. We are poised to have this funding to use, whether we decide to break down the hospitals or not, to certainly make them state-of-the-art in terms of their ability to respond to the health care of our residents. And you have pivotal pieces already in place. You have a cardiac center at the Wang Louis Hospital. You have a cancer center at the hospital in St. Thomas. And so if you thought about how you bring all of these pieces together, the possibility is great to create a dynamic healthcare system that people can come here to get healthcare, the same way that we would go to Puerto Rico not very long ago to do that.
So people don't have to fly off anymore. I think that's a problem for a lot of people.
And it's not a far off concept. We already have constructed some of the facilities for the school. The administration building is already constructed at the campus of the St. Thomas campus and the simulation center in St. Croix. I believe when we get that off the ground, and I personally believe I have a difference of opinion with regard to how the university pursued it, because we had two choices on the table. One was to create a medical school in connection with a known university, Boston, that we already have a relationship with, Emory, Johns Hopkins, who knows. And the other was to start from scratch. We decided to start from scratch because some donor said he was going to give us $30 million, and that I haven't seen it yet. But I believe we should get it back on track and get that off the ground, because the research also shows that you can keep your doctors, and that's a problem that we have here, attracting specialists to the territory. Well, if you train and educate them here and you provide residencies for them here, it is a great possibility that you can keep some of those here as well. And I think we have the pieces, we just need a vision to tie them together and to really put us in a place of improving healthcare and the economic climate altogether, for the territory.
I think the other piece of it too is when you look at the money that we spend on healthcare, with Cigna alone, between the government and the employees, you pay $160 million. You pay $80 million for each hospital. That's $320 million for healthcare for 100,000 people. And what happens is the people that fall in the gap, the hospital ends up picking up the bill and eating it anyway. People always talk about expanding the capacity of healthcare so we have more single payer providers, but they ignore the fact that it's $20,000 a year for health insurance. Either people who can't get health insurance can't afford $20,000 a year. I think we really need to look at how do we create a sort of self-care for our hospitals and the people who live here, right? Because we take care of them anyway. And that would give you an emergency plan, like if you break your leg or something like that, you could go to the hospital and you would have a reduction in your costs, and then be able to give you some type of pharmacy plan that could take care of your diabetes or your insulin for those people who fall in the gap. If you think about it, for $100 a month, just on St. Thomas, with working people alone, that's $23 million a year extra, more than $23 million extra a year in health insurance, in health money that could be generated. So if we could lower the cost of Cigna, incorporate a plan that powers the local hospital and encourage people to get preventative care, as well as be able to give you an emergency care plan. I think what we do is we strengthen our hospital system, we encourage more people to use it, and we build back the confidence. And so we lose less money, as we are now, with people moving off island for insured healthcare service.
Let's go to government transparency. The MAP administration recently put up a website. They launched a website that kind of details the expenses in relation to hurricane recovery. But there's also the problem of the governor not allowing people to see what he's doing with the government credit cards. So it's kind of like a message that's kind of mixed to people. How would you approach that? Because right now people, you hear it in the streets, they're not trusting the government more.
Well, one thing about the Bryan Roach team is we've been effective, and we've been effective in creating transparency, because we started talking about doing just what the MAP team did, and they did it. We started talking about tuition, free tuition, they put forward a bill. We put signs on people's roads saying, looking forward to pave your road. The road was paved. So, we make them motivate and get things done. But transparency is a serious issue in the government, and I think that there's a lot of information available, but the way it's available is very stagnant, like the budget book or a report. We plan to be as transparent as possible, and I've had this discussion with the Daily News as well. Transparency is expensive. I don't want people to miss that fact, these are monies that would not be put into programming. So to build a website and to have it updated and be able to see how much money is being spent all the time, that costs a little money to get the setup. And then you have to have somebody to keep that information up to date. So we're going to make an effort to make this information available to the public. In terms of the governor's office or any other office of the government responding to requests from the press or anybody else, the Sunshine Act is in place. And we'll make those available. I'm still a little foggy around. I've been doing some research on things like autopsies. I don't know, some states allow for autopsies to be public information after the investigation is complete and the court case is settled. So there going to have to be some conversations that we have with the legislature to clarify our public transparency law. And then the meetings law, which has been of great debate for a long time. I think we need to move to get that settled, because it seems like the Daily News, not to put them on the spot, brings it up every time you have an assembly of public officials and that they're not allowed to be in. So we need to sit with the legislature and the public and really come to agreement on what that really means.
And I would just add that I think the issue of transparency usually arises with regard to press requests. I mean, that's how a lot of us get our information. The average citizen is not filing a request for Freedom of Information Act request to the government. And it revolves mostly around, a lot of the times, about what's happening with the government money. What are people being paid? What are the raises that we don't know about that you implement after you presented your budget? These are the kinds of things that are important. And I think there is, as Albert said, there are those instances where you need to clarify the statement of the law, but with regard to public funds and what people earn, those are not protected pieces of information. And people have a right to know, and when you don't provide the information, then you create all of this speculation about what it is you're trying to hide. And if you want people to respect the government, and if you want to conduct business in a way that people respect the processes that you have in place, then you follow the law to the extent that you can, and provide the information so that people can use it.
I think the other piece to that too is one of the things that I think we've been very lax on is policy. If you look at the rules and regulation, a lot of the policy, they haven't been updated since like the Farrelly administration, which is over 20-something years ago, maybe 30. So you have these laws, the lieutenant governor's housing, for instance, right? It doesn't say you can't do it, but it doesn't say you can do it. I think when these issues come up, we need to have clarifying policy that states, no, you can't do that. We don't address these things. Where the governor lives, how much money is in a case of emergency, how much money is allowable to make due for a governor's residence? How much money is allowed on trips for the governor? What is he allowed to spend? We kind of playing gotcha with these issues instead of clearly delineating what the policy should be, and then you have the role. Last night, the lawmaker or whoever is affected complied. Last night I had a great discussion with one of my, I could call him a student because he's in school, about the recent scandal at the Casino Commission and the outlining of the spending that went on there. And he of course, he was ready to crucify the management in charge. But then when he looked at the law and started to look at the policies, he realized there's no policy guiding these things. We have to have concrete policy, and we keep running into the same problems over and over again, and not understanding that we are policy makers. We're the one that say what the law should be, what the limits are, and we have to establish those firmly so that there's no gray area about what is to occur. And that is why you have situation where the governor is paying for a nursemaid for his mom, or be able to pay $100,000 back for an employee's payment to out of the PFA funds. Those things shouldn't occur, but there's no policy that speaks to what is wrong.
That you can't do it. We're going to wrap up in a little bit, but I wanted to raise one of the criticisms that were levied against you was that you were never elected into office, and somehow for your critics that translates to a lack of ability to govern. How would you, and I guess this this goes towards both of you as we
I've been
try to.
elected.
Yeah, you've been elected 3 times, Senator, to the Senate. But as we wrap up, I just wanted you to address that, and also, I guess in a way, also try to convince people to go out and vote on November 20th and to vote for your ticket.
For me, when my critics talk about me not being elected before, I'm like, yeah, I haven't. That's a good thing. I think that going into government as an administrator and the Commissioner of Labor, I was able to look at things purely from a mechanical operational point of view and not intersperse too much politics into it. We get into these discussions with our community that are guided by political favor and being reelected. For me, I'm trying to look at my community, understand where it's hurting, where the opportunities are, and help them to get to someplace else. When we talk about changing the course of the Virgin Islands, it's about finally resolving some of these problems that have been languishing for 40 years. Paying attention to people and moving them along a continuum that allows them for a better quality of life, things like healthcare and education, and allows the Virgin Islands to grow as an economy and respect its ecology and the environment around it. You vote for the Tregenza Roach and the Albert Bryan team because we have a different approach to government, one that really concentrates on moving people forward and not about money and things and building, but about building people and creating a Virgin Islands environment that's for all of us.
Senator, last words.
Well, I think when I think about Albert and myself, I think a lot of people who end up in elected office here, one of the deficiencies has been the lack of experience in the private sector, that we need people who have exposure to both. And in Albert and I, probably half of our lives are divided between public and private sector employment. It is a critical thing to understand the needs of business as well as it is to understand the needs of the private sector. And both of us, I think, bring a thoughtful approach to whatever we do. The deliberations in the Senate, I have been known for the way that I approach things, from the analytical, research, etc. I managed a newsroom when I was 23. That was my first career.
Wow.
At 23, the youngest news editor in the history of the Daily News. You could check that out on the
Yep, I saw that. Yeah.
And worked in private enterprise with regard to working at the law firm, so Bowen Handy, etc. I've worked in the government, and I firmly believe that we are as ready as you can be. The office of the Lieutenant Governor, that used to be a place that I hung out and did all my title searches, filed corporate documents, etc. And I have a clear understanding of what we need for that office. We need a safe environment for the people there to work in. We need professional development and state-of-the-art equipment. And we need technology. And we need to protect those original documents that are still vulnerable, in those spaces. And we are ready to start. So vote number 5.
And most of all, as you can see from the interview, we're truly a team.
Well, I can see that. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for clarifying some of the issues and for laying out your platforms and just sharing your enthusiasm and your readiness to govern. We want to invite our viewers to go and vote on November 20th. Make sure that you go to our Facebook page. Your polling sites are there. Election updates are going to be there. And then on election night, we're going to be covering the results as they come in. So tune in 7 o'clock on election night, November 20th, via Channel 4 and 504. Again, thank you so much for joining us. You were watching the News 2 Election Special, sponsored by the Bryan Roach Campaign.